Over 100 years ago, in the UK, one of the biggest stars in the country was this man, Noel Coward. Now, most people of my generation were introduced to him in this film, The Italian Job, where he played the incarcerated gangster Mr. Bridger. But in his heyday, from the 1920s onwards, Noel Coward broke into the UK celebrity mainstream as a playwright. He remained very much in the public spotlight for 30 years. But by the 1950s, post-World War II, British culture was shifting, and his many years at the top were now coming to an end. And during the 1950s, he expressed a strong dislike for the new, bleaker direction he observed in theatre, culture and the arts, and confessed to a sense of despair for the direction in which post-war British culture was moving. The refined way of the upper classes was losing its grip on the mainstream, whereas the edgier, grittier way of the working classes was now starting to catch up. And, interestingly, despite Noel Coward having been a rebel against the status quo when he was a young man, when a new generation of rebels came along in the 1960s, the Beatles, he found himself very firmly in the disapproving older man camp, and also seemingly totally unaware of the irony of his position. Beatle Paul McCartney, however, had grown up with the music of Noel Coward, played to him by his dad. And that's not the only connection between McCartney and Coward. From 1961 to 1963, the Beatles played regularly at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. And in the 90s, DJ Bob Wooler told Goldmine magazine how he used to introduce Paul before he took to the stage, saying, "Paul McCartney was interested in what I had to say about songs, and Noel Coward, for instance. I talked to him about Noel Coward and how clever and witty he was. And this is what I miss about rock and roll songs, the absence of wit. There's so very few of them have any wit about them, which is very sad. They're all rather long-suffering, these songs. When I'm 64 is really, I think, the only witty Beatles song, which is essentially a McCartney number. When I used to introduce Paul at the Cavern, occasionally I'd say, now Paul's going to sing a song of his own he's written. He's the Noel Coward of rock and roll." I think he liked that appellation, that description. And Paul's regular ventures into slightly more sentimental or perhaps dated styles of music during the Beatle years shows that he was, of all of them, the one who was the closest to Noel Coward in style and taste. In early 1964, the Beatles met singer Alma Cogan at rehearsals for Sunday night at the London Palladium. Alma apparently got on well with all the Beatles, hitting it off with John Lennon in particular, and it was at her birthday party later that year that she became the cultural bridge between Noel Coward and Lennon and McCartney, because she invited all of them. Noel Coward, however, did not seem all that impressed with them on first encounter. Craig Brown writes, "The dislikes of Noel Coward were legion, spanning most of the 20th century and much of the 19th. They included Marilyn Monroe, who he called a silly bitch, Oscar Wilde, who he described as a silly, conceited, inadequate creature, Mandy Rice Davies, who he referred to as a squalid, conceited, nasty little slut, and Samuel Beckett, of whom he said, 'I would rather play bingo every night for a year than pay a return visit to Waiting for Godot.'" So it should come as no surprise that the Master, as he was known, had little time for the Beatles. When the Beatles first met Coward in June 1964, it all seemed to go swimmingly. The flamboyant singer Alma Cogan introduced Coward to John and Paul. He found them pleasant young men, quite well behaved, and with an amusing way of speaking. But Coward made the mistake of relaying his encounter with John and Paul in derogatory terms to David Lewin of the Daily Mail. It never occurred to him that Lewin would quote him in print. David Lewin published Noel Coward's private and fairly waspish comments on the Beatles in the Daily Mail on June the 5th, 1964, saying they were totally devoid of talent. There is a great deal of noise. In my day, the young were taught to be seen, but not heard. And of course, the Beatles were made aware of the article and were not impressed. In June the following year, the news broke that the Beatles were being awarded MBEs. And in his diary entry on Wednesday, June the 23rd, 1965, Noel Coward wrote this: The Beatles have all four been awarded MBEs, which has caused a considerable outcry. Furious war heroes are sending back their bravely won medals by the bushel. It is, of course, a tactless and major blunder on the part of the Prime Minister. And also, I don't think the Queen should have agreed. Some other decoration should have been selected to reward them for their talentless but considerable contributions to the Exchequer. A few days after writing that diary entry, however, Noel Coward was in Rome on the 27th of June, having attended the wedding of a Spanish princess the day before. And the Beatles were also in Rome, playing 2 concerts. And it seems at this point that Noel Coward decided to relent, to let his guard down a bit, to go along to the show and see what all the hype was about. But, hilariously, he couldn't have chosen a worse time. Finding himself with time on his hands, he went to where the Beatles were playing. It seems more than likely that he was the only 66-year-old man in the audience. And it proved to be an unusually raucous and ramshackle concert, possibly owing to the fact that the theatre was half empty, giving the Beatles license to fool around. While Ringo was singing I Wanna Be Your Man, Paul contracted a fit of the giggles and had to leave the stage, while George, unamused, scowled in his direction. Then, on his return to the stage, Paul's microphone toppled over, which set John laughing, though George remained irritated. But not half so irritated as Noel Coward, who spent most of his time with his fingers in his ears. And that's not all, because apparently, according to a newspaper clipping from the time, the shows were incredibly hot in Rome during a heatwave in the mid-afternoon in a venue with no air conditioning, and tickets were also priced quite high, which might go some way to explaining why they played to a half-empty house, and why Noel Coward's experience was so hilariously underwhelming. Here's a few excerpts from his diary describing the experience. On the Sunday night I went to see the Beatles. I had never seen them in the flesh before. The noise was deafening throughout, and I couldn't hear a word they sang or a note they played. Just one long ear-splitting din. Apparently they were not a success. The notices were bad the next day. It is still impossible to judge from their public performance whether they have talent or not. They were professional, had a certain guileless charm, and stayed on mercifully for not too long. But I was truly horrified and shocked by the audience. The whole thing is, to me, an unpleasant phenomenon. To realise that the majority of the modern adolescent world goes ritualistically mad over those 4 innocuous, rather silly-looking young men is a disturbing thought. Perhaps we are whirling more swiftly into extinction than we know. Personally, I should have liked to take some of those squealing young maniacs and crack their heads together. I'm all for audiences going mad with enthusiasm after a performance, but not incessantly during the performance so that there ceases to be a performance. Noel Coward was clearly not used to the volume a rock concert would be at, the screaming, or the shambolic larking around on stage. And he might have been interested to learn in later years that the Beatles actually kind of agreed with him. They didn't like the audiences just screaming incessantly all the way through and not listening to a note they played. But despite what to him was an awful experience, after the show, nonetheless, Noel Coward decided to try and be gracious and to go and have a chat to the Beatles and congratulate them. His diary entry continues, I went backstage to see them and was met by Brian Epstein, who told me they had gone back to the hotel and would I go there. So off I went. And in preparation of Noel Coward's arrival, Brian went to talk to the band, but they were still smarting from his comments in the newspaper and were not willing. Paul recalls, Brian came and said, Noel Coward would like to meet you boys. We all just said, oh fucking hell no, no, I'm going to bed. Nobody was really keen, we were better just casually interacting with people. No one was going to go, and Brian said, you can't, you just can't. But despite Brian Epstein's pleading, the Beatles refused to meet him, so Brian had to go back and apologise. Coward continues, after being received by Brian Epstein and Wendy Hansen and given a drink, I was told that the Beatles refused to see me because that ass David Lewin had quoted me saying unflattering things about them months ago. I thought this graceless in the extreme, but decided to play it with firmness and dignity. I asked Wendy to go and fetch one of them. And so Wendy Hansen, Brian Epstein's assistant, went back and pleaded with the Beatles one more time. And of course, ever the diplomat and the one who had actually been nicknamed Noel Coward in the past, Paul McCartney ended up relenting. Paul thought, we can't snub Noel Coward. He's 2 flights downstairs and he's asked to meet us. He's the grand old dame of British show business and we're the new young things. So Paul went alone to meet him. Noel Coward continues, Wendy finally reappeared with Paul McCartney and I explained gently but firmly that one did not pay much attention to the statements of newspaper reporters. The poor boy was quite amiable and I sent messages of congratulation to his colleagues, although the message I would have liked to send them was that they were bad-mannered little shits. But it's my opinion that Paul McCartney actually wasn't the only Beatle who decided to just be diplomatic and keep the peace. Right around the same time as their encounter in Rome, John Lennon's book A Spaniard in the Works had also been published, just a few days before the Rome gigs. And in later years through an auction site it came to light that a copy was sent to Noel Coward from John Lennon with a handwritten inscription from John. Who knows, perhaps just a small behind-the-scenes gesture and peace offering. But as far as I know, that's the last time their paths actually crossed. Noel Coward passed away in 1973 and his diaries were then published in 1982, at which point his pretty scathing, brutal opinion of the Beatles was made public. And, perhaps understandably, Paul McCartney was not impressed, and in the years that followed said this, I went down and met him, but then he said some not too pleasant things about us after that, so fuck him. By 1998, however, Paul's irritation had mellowed and he actually paid tribute to him by recording a cover of his famous song, A Room with a View, which was included on the Noel Coward tribute album, 20th Century Blues, suggesting that, at long last, the hatchet had been buried and the bright young thing of the 60s had finally moved on from his unfair treatment at the hands of the bright young thing of the 20s. And that's the end of the story. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time. And as always, a massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. If you would be interested in being credited at the end of videos and getting access to exclusive content, the link is in the description, and hopefully I'll see you inside.